Have you ever, ever had someone walk up to you and say, hey, somebody gave me $5 million. And you'd be like, what? You wouldn't believe it. You think they'd be lying. You know. You just wouldn't believe it. You wouldn't believe somebody walked up to him and gave him $5 million. I mean, even if it was someone they knew and they loved, $5 million, you just wouldn't believe it. Or if somebody pulled up that you knew in a brand new Bugatti and said somebody gave it to him. You think they stole it. How about this one? We came from Europe and the Indians gave us North America. Yeah, they gave it to us and we adopted all of their customs. Just don't believe it. Out of order. A black man. That's right, a black man. A black man born in Vancouver, British Columbia, settled in Chehalis in 1876 and established his seal in 1889. A black man built the White House. A black man named Charles Wesson, who they called George Washington or George Washington Carver. He was the American dream. The same American dream that Barack Obama spoke of, the audacity to dream. George Washington was the first black president. He built the White House. George Washington built the White House, the Space Needle, the Smith Tower, the Sears Tower. George Washington was a carver. And spoke very well. Or should I say, very well spoken. This is the Capitol building that was built and established in 1876. It is located in Olympia, Washington. Olympia, Washington is not to be confused with Washington, D.C. Olympia, Washington was established long before Washington, D.C. Olympia, Washington Capitol building was built long before Washington, D.C. Sinai is the actual Choctaw name for the legislation created to govern George Washington. Sinai was not to appropriate funds to states and nations. Sinai was created with one thing in purpose, and that was to serve and protect George Washington. The word Sinai means that you all are down and you know you are down. And I am up. That's what the word means. Sinai says, because I am up, I know you want me down. And so he created a federal building, and this building lays right outside of the Capitol building. And this was the first federal building, what we call a jailhouse and a courthouse. This was what we call the first Supreme Court, where the Library of Congress is then established. So the bottom was there for the administrative part and duties, and the top part was there to hold prisoners. This is important because Sinai is a book that was written, and it talks about how Washington State's laws and statutes supersede those of Washington, D.C. And people can say, well, how so? Because Washington, D.C. is the nation's capital. And I say, actually, the Washington State seal establishes that the laws and statutes were established in 1889. Therefore, Washington, D.C., U.S. Congress uses these laws and these statutes that were established in Washington State. Now, this very same court building that sits across from the Capitol building is where George Washington, who built everything in the town, and of course people voted him to be the president, right? Because he knew what was best, right? He knew how to build everything, right? Houses, instruments, tools, furniture, whatever was needed. Now, he established what we know now as trade and economic entrepreneurship. He created a coin. And this, again, is the seal of Washington State. 1889 in stone. Now, this seal established that this was a state, in fact, and this was George Washington, in fact, and this was his state in 1889. And so they would stamp this seal. But it was even more valuable. He took the seal across the street to this federal building and created coins. And for one of these coins with his face on it, you were able to fill a bag of groceries up with one coin. But this coin was silver. That's right, silver. So, make no mistake about it. You could get all of that for a quarter? No. The quarter was made of silver. And you say, well, why did they call it a quarter? Because of that so much away. It weighed 0.25. That's how much the silver weighed. So how else are you going to know how much you have in silver if you don't weigh silver out? So, one, I want to establish that George Washington was, in fact, a black man, and he built the first White House in Washington State. And Washington State was established before Washington, D.C. Now, Washington State has a Georgetown. Obviously, because George Washington lived here in Washington State. And Georgetown is known to be the first place where anyone had ever seen electricity. It was lit up. he had established electricity in Georgetown, and people would come near and far to listen to what they heard as records. And see lights. And the people that couldn't get in would stand on the outside because you could see if you stood near it. And so this was Georgetown. This was a place where George Washington would come, and let's say it was his place to entertain and host. Right near Georgetown is where he created airplanes. And there's an airport museum and the first airport runway where he would create airplanes. And so this was his playgrounds of sorts. To the right was a baseball field. And so he would go out to each township, or what we call districts. And for each district, they would create and establish a monument. And so you would know your district by the monument that was established. Because again, George Washington was a carver. And you can imagine why people voted him to be the leader. So throughout Washington State, these amazing attractions were created and were being created in the mid 1800s and the early 1900s. Things that were so amazing that people came from near and far and around the world to see electricity, to see an elevator, to see what they would call a skyscraper. So, Washington State's legislation process, and this again is the capital, and it looks very similar to Washington D.C.'s Capitol building. However, our Capitol building is the higher, taller, sculptured building because, well, it was built first, and when George Washington built it, you have to keep in mind he was a carver. So he did these things out of creativity, out of love for what he was doing and for the people he was doing it for. So he gathered thoughtfulness into what he would sculpture and why. And so if you notice the lights before, so if this building was created and established again back in 1876, so you see that the windows are up top and it's very high, almost as if it's a cathedral of sorts. But the opening of the actual building and the vaultedness of the sculpture. And so Washington State's legislative process was again established. And legislation is what we call the laws that we create. So the actual enactment enacting of a law is what we call legislation. Now, this process happens through what we call sessions, and these sessions are recorded. And initially, these sessions in Washington State, keep in mind, were there to protect George Washington, and it acted as the criminal justice system. So it did not act as a legislative system. The Senate was there to be the actual supreme law. So, Washington State is in the top left of North America. It is on the edge of North America. It is near Canada. Canada, BC. The BC is British Columbia. British Columbia borders and touches Washington State. Beneath Washington State is Oregon. And Oregon is across a bridge of water. There is a river, the Columbia River, that separates Washington State from Oregon. So, above Washington State, there is Vancouver, BC, and beneath Washington State, there is the Columbia River. And Vancouver, Washington. So, Vancouver, Washington, below Washington State, and Vancouver, British Columbia, which is above Washington State. It is awfully confusing if you are unfamiliar with geography. Vancouver, British Columbia is a part of Washington State that sits north. Vancouver is also a city that sits in Washington State on the border of Oregon, which again is not the same as Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is not even considered a state, and Washington, D.C. sits on the other end of North America, and there is a river, the Delaware River, and this is what we are taught by the George Washington that they teach you about in school. The first president was George Washington, and he came across the Delaware. We said, where did he come from? Well, he came across the Delaware. Well, the Delaware is still in North America. It's a river. But this is all they say when we ask, where did George Washington come from? I never ever got an answer. I don't know if anyone else got an answer about where he actually came from. We do always hear about 1776. The 1776 story. Now, they say that the Declaration in the United States was established in 1776, so we would agree that George Washington was a part of that. Then they tell you about the cherry tree, or was it an apple tree? Anyway, Washington State has apple trees and cherry trees. So we have apple blossom. George Washington chops down the tree and he can't tell a lie. Then they teach you about George Washington being on the dollar bill. That's right. That's George Washington on the dollar bill. That's our first president. That's pretty much, pretty much all you are taught about George Washington. Oh, let me not forget to mention the wooden leg. Again, carving stuff. Here we go again. Here we go again. The wooden teeth. Oh my goodness. Carving stuff. Okay. Anyway. George Washington was in the military? Who was he fighting? The British? Okay. Alright. Alright. I hope it wasn't the British up in our Washington. Because our George Washington was probably not fighting the British when he was born in British Columbia. So, really, we have to establish that, one, Washington State was established in 1889 according to the seal. 1889 is the seal of Washington State. There, a Senate was established. The purpose of the Senate and the purpose of Sine Die was to legislate law concerning the protection and service of the president, who at the time was George Washington. The Senate was the highest in the Supreme Court, there again to protect and serve the president, George Washington. So that was the purpose and the only purpose of the Senate. It was not to establish laws for each state. That was not the purpose of the Senate. Now, let's talk a little bit more about Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is the District of Columbia. It is not even considered a state. However, they are a district. And right north of Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, is a Georgetown too. So they created them a Georgetown over there. So you got, notice how this Washington is all the way by the Atlantic, all the way down south. We're almost kitty corner from one another. All the way down south by the Atlantic Ocean. And there's a Georgetown over there too. You know, they make sure of that. Now, their Georgetown, if we were driving, would be 6 hours and 57 minutes away from their Washington, D.C., their District of Columbia that they created. Because again, it is not a state. Like Chicago is in the state of Illinois, and Harlem is in the state of New York, and Tampa is in the state of Florida. Washington, D.C. is not a state. And it's not in a state. Anyway, that's strange. However, this is what we would consider whitewashing, possibly to confuse people and misguide people into believing something that is untrue. So, what is the purpose of creating a Washington, D.C. District of Columbia when their story is that George Washington crossed the Delaware? Now, all Washington, we say that he crossed the Elkhart, but Columbia River is there, and British Columbia exists, and so these things are relatable. To say District of Columbia, throw it all the way to the East Coast by the Atlantic. It's not a city. It's not a state. It's just somewhere where you just made this place and named it that. And then there's Georgetown, 6 hours and something away. Our Georgetown's not that far away from our Washington. However, our Georgetown is inside of our Washington. And so it's important to note that our Washington was established well before the District of Columbia was established. If you take these tactics and we flip them the other way, and we turned the tables and we said, you know, DC Washington is down. Slaves built DC's Washington. As a Washington State, a black man who was the first president, George Washington, he built his own. And they had, according to Washington, D.C.'s White House, they had a white man from France come in and tell black slaves how to build it. This is their story. Now, it's probably more likely to believe that whoever built theirs first would be telling the truth and would have a true story. And could possibly be telling a true story, because typically the first story is usually the true story. Now, can you tell which Washington this is? Is this DC or is this Washington State? Look close. Because if people don't know geography, then they don't know if it's a different Washington. When you say Washington and you see this picture, you tell me which Washington you think it is. Somebody's copying somebody. But one of these people are doing their own thing. Count the ridges on this Washington. How many rings do you see? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I counted 5 rings. Like a 5-tier cake of sorts. Which Washington is this? People that don't know are confused, and people wanted to confuse people. I think that's why they did this. Okay, is this the same one or is this a different one? Which Washington is this? Is that the same one or is that a different one? The steps, and you have your main floor. Now, the funny thing about our Capitol building, today they will call it the mayor's mansion. Or is it the governor's mansion? It's the governor's mansion. They try to take it a notch up. See, how they set up our systems today is that they will act as if the governor is the president of your state. So they will set these systems up in place. So then they tried to create these capitol buildings everywhere and say, sit a governor in there. Because it wouldn't look right if Washington State, again, first black president, then you go and you try to say somebody gave it to you, like the brand new Bugatti and $5 million, and nobody believes you. Then now they encourage people to create capitol buildings for every state. That every state has a capital. But remember, District of Columbia is not even a state, and it's not really a capital either. So now they say it's the national capital. It's the capital of all the states. Now, here's another one. Here's another picture. Do we know which one this is? See, one of them is smaller than the other. One of the tiers are missing. One of them have 3 rings, and one of them have 5 rings. And I bet you bottom dollar, I bet you I know who has 5 rings and who has 3 rings. No bull. No bull, I bet you bottom dollar. Who has 5 rings and who has 3 rings? I'm gonna guess Olympia, Washington has 5 rings. Just because of the Olympian symbol, the 5 rings. All connected together. 5 rings. Like the 5-tier cake and all those things are Choctaw tradition, so pretty sure that the Washington State is probably gonna have the 5 rings. Now, take a look at this. Here's a $5 bill, which again, by the way, is an original bill that was created by the original George Washington. And on the back of it, this is the Senate. And this Senate is the Senate that's in Washington State. This is how the Senate looks in Washington. This is the Senate in Washington State on the back of the $5 bill. So this is the Senate. And the Senate on the back of the $5 bill in Washington State, because we have a Senate too in Washington State. Remember, ours was created first. And the Senate sits on our left. So you have your right, you have your Capitol building. On the left side of us, the Senate sits. And on the $5 bill, there you have the Senate And it is the Senate building that is located in Washington State. And so make sure you understand that the $5 bill was initially one of the first bills created, the 5 and the 1 and the $2 bill. So we want to make certain that we understand that Washington State is a state and it was established 1889 with the seal and stone and the stamp. And at this time, a Senate was established, as well as a Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court system, and a Library of Congress, which established all of the laws and statutes, or should I say the statutes, the laws, and the checks. So, these monuments, or these things that he would create, would then be landmarks for districts. In each district, he established that they would have to take care of their districts. See, because he would create it and implement these things, and then they would be responsible for their own district. If somebody did not follow his orders, then they would be brought in to the Supreme Court. Now, to this day, we have a circuit court here in Washington State, and the circuit court is just what it is. It is not an appellate court, it is a circuit court. It is there to establish the law. It acts as a criminal justice system. Understanding that a citation code is a citation code. An administrative code is an administrative code. There's no need for an administrative code. If there is an established Senate. So, the Washington State History Museum was cited to be established in 1887. This museum is very historical. It plays a very prominent part of history. It is where we call Tacoma, Washington. And Tacoma, Washington is known for TTD. And TTD is the initials for Tacoma Tone District. You could tone in to Tacoma, the first switchboard. Now this is a $10 bill. A $10 bill then is established later. The $10 bill is not established by Washington State, no. The $10 bill is then created by members in Washington, D.C., not to be confused with our George Washington. The $10 bill also has a picture of the Senate. It's the Senate of Washington, D.C. And their Senate is much larger than ours. Their Senate sits on the right side of their Capitol building. Now, I toured the Washington State Capitol building, I believe, once in 2007. And then I think I took another tour in 2009. All-day tour of the mansion. And they call it the mansion. Now, that being said, I have also personally toured the National Capitol building. Once in 2009, and then another time in 1997, I do believe Bill Clinton was the president the first time, and the second time Obama's 2009 inauguration. So, that being said, with my own eyes, I do see that the Senate in Washington, D.C. sits to the right, and the Senate building in Washington State sits to the left. Now, the House. Initially, George Washington of Washington State, the first president, had the House. And the House that was established in 1889 consists of the Help. It was simply the Help that he had hired help and hired hands. And they were considered the House. And they got to sleep in that building. That was their building. They all lived in that building. The Senate is what we would act as or call our Supreme Court, really. Because it was the highest court. It was the Senate. And the Senate were established elders. Because again, their story is that they adopted everything and all their traditions from the natives or the Indians or the native Indians or the Native Americans. That being their story, the Senate was there to enforce all laws in all of the districts that George Washington had established in Washington State. So this was already established before they created the White House in Washington, D.C. Because again, I just showed you the Washington State History Museum. And again, it shows TTD and Dalton, where people would have the switchboard, the first switchboard to ever call in and out and to get patched through to anyone right here in Tacoma, Washington. The Supreme Court, State of Washington. The seal of the Supreme Court, State of Washington. So we have a circuit court, Ninth Circuit Court, here in the state of Washington. In the event that the United States Supreme Court, or what you guys call the United States Supreme Court, the justices cannot decide, then it goes back to Washington State Supreme Court. And our state has to step in to make a decision. This is George Washington, who built the very first White House. He wasn't a slave. He was the president. He built it and he lived in it. He established Georgetown. He established Senate laws. He was a black man. He didn't give it away to the Europeans or the French or the Indians or the Native Americans. The rightful owner.